Land+Civilization Compositions, так називається школа, засновником якої є Джейсон Hilgefort. Він працює, ну, можна сказати, на всій планеті Земля, починаючи з Нью-Йорку, продовжуючи Лос-Анджелесом і закінчуючи в Мумбаї. Ну, а на даний час він також є науковим керівником Future Plus та Aformal Academy у місті Шенчжень у Китаї. Студія, якою керує Джейсон, досліджує урбанізм як, увага, складову створення міста, а не життя у місті лише. Тож під ваші бурхливі оплески Джейсон Hilgefort на цій сцені.
Thank you. All right, the mic is working. Let me just check. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming after lunch. Let me say first, it's an honor to be here. I've been here a few times now. It's good to be back. It's been 4 years. The festival keeps better and getting better and better, so it's a pleasure for them to allow me to be part of it. But with that, I'll kind of speak in 3 sections today because I do a few things. I'll speak a bit about general cities and trends. I'll talk about an office I have, Land+Civilization Compositions, with my partner. And I'll talk about a school I'm a part of in China. So first of all, and I think when I see some of the graphics, as usual, CANactions is ahead of the discourse in the world. But this notion of how we think of cities has changed these days. It used to be the idea of making a city was easy. You make a master plan, you hire someone to draw it, you get some architects to do some very fancy buildings, and you let the people move in, and that's how you do urban planning. Very simple. But for me, it fundamentally changed, and I'll tell a story to give an example of this. When I was working in the Netherlands, I worked for an office, and we did the master plan for the central station. We did the usual things. We designed fancy public space. We talked about how the buildings were going to be built. We talked about an idea of public spaces in elevated locations. And we had a whole master plan developed about these ideas, because it had to deal with crossing the train tracks. So these elevated public spaces had a logic. But then the crisis hit the Netherlands very hard in 2008, and I'll talk about that more. But then another office, which I later joined, Zeus, said, well, let's start doing this plan now. Let's build the bridge now. We don't need to wait on master plans. We can do this with some crowdfunding. We can execute and test this idea immediately. And perhaps you can see the bridge here, crossing over the train tracks. But perhaps much more interestingly, what they did was what a lot of people do. They took what used to be one of the best places in Rotterdam to get illegal drugs, because there are illegal drugs in the Netherlands. They took that parking lot and just asked a lot of their friends to start selling beer, having galleries, coffee. And within 3 years, when the Dutch were doing very well in the World Cup, of course they didn't win, they never win the World Cup, but when they did want to, ESPN wanted to cut to a shot of the Netherlands celebrating a goal, they cut to this crowd in this parking lot celebrating. So in 3 years, this area really changed, not because of a master plan, but because someone else did. But then the master plan happened, and this is where I think it gets even more interesting, or it started to happen. The fancy central station was built, even the queen showed up and cut the ribbon and all the things that queens and kings do. But then what was interesting is the city of Rotterdam wanted to continue this idea of experimentation, and they had an open call to anyone to suggest ideas. And MBRDV, which if you don't know is a very famous architecture office, so they don't have to do simple art pop-up projects, they suggested to build this temporary stair just to go up the stairs from the square to the top of this building. And they executed it. So this idea that the city can be played with, can be an experiment, was something that starts to push beyond. It's not once the master plan is done that the city is done. We can continue to play with the city. And then talking about this notion of values, picking up on this, I really like the theme of this year's CANactions, what I call objectification. The idea that, especially in architects, we think about buildings as objects. As planners, we think about a plan. Landscape architects as well, we think about plans as objects. But are these objects really making our cities better? are these, forgive me, I give this lecture mostly in China, so all these buildings are in China. But do these buildings really help our cities? Do we as architects making star architecture, do we really make a city a better place? This is something we need to question as a value. Does this really help our city? And then even, and again I saw this before, but who even makes the city? Again, before I suggested that it used to be just assumed to be architects, urban planners, wealthy people, and the government. Now it can be discussed, it's very different. In some cases, a chef coming to a neighborhood can change a neighborhood because the right chef comes to the neighborhood, can fundamentally transform a building. Or in other cases, an artist can come in and just do a simple artwork with the community and transform the way the community sees itself and others see itself. And an example where I'm from in the United States, in Chicago, an artist started by transforming his house, later started doing civic buildings for the community, and now does full-on master plans. So who creates and shapes and makes the city? We're all aware that it's not the usual standard assumption. And then even as architects, urban planners, whoever, we always assume that the city is permanent. This is something that we kind of like about what we do. It'll be there after we die. Cities are permanent. But I think that becomes very obviously questionable these days. Factories are oftentimes torn down and replaced. You can see in many cities, this got lost in the email, but you can see that cities start to get torn down and replaced, that cities are not permanent. And even thinking more about how high tech is coming, we can think about even the temporary state of the buildings around us or the spaces around us. Couldn't we have a more dynamic city around us where these objects allow our city to move and interact with us? This is something we need to start thinking about. And then even fundamentally, what is a city? How do you define a city? In the old definition of city, it was pretty easy. There was an administrative boundary, which had a wall, and that wall was the city. Inside was city, outside was not. But now, with all the systems we have in our cities, and all the things that need to feed into it, what is city? Is it limited by where we get the power for the city? Is it defined by where we get the food for the city that we need to eat in these places? Is it about the water systems that affect our cities? These infrastructural realities really affect our cities and question even how we think about it. So with that, now I'll talk a bit more about myself. With these sort of questions is how myself and my partner Merva Badir, we founded our little office called Land+Civilization Compositions, which I think we founded at about the time we were here at CANactions 4 or 5 years ago. We wanted to explore different things, because in the past, yes, I worked on big master plans in the US, worked on kind of, let's say, fancy buildings. This one happens to be in India, did parks. This one happens to be in Belgium. And then before I left the practice I was at, we were working on big scale master planning projects, which I really liked. But when I started to look back, once we had our own office, and I really started to think about what we wanted to do and what we were interested in, I started to think actually about some of the more odd projects I worked on. When I worked in India, we really designed an elephant village. So we had to think about what the elephant wanted out of the community and how that related to the family. And me and my partner talked more and more about how the reality of urbanism is really changing. And it's allowed to be much more than what just used to be urban planning or doing massing on a big scale. There's a lot more opportunities for urbanism to be more art-based, even more policy-based, program-based. There was a lot more room for diversity. That slide's unreadable. But when we won Europan, or I won Europan with some other people, we started with a very normal project, another kind of standard urban planning project, which is very nice, but we started to think about what other things did we really want to do. And then we were lucky enough to get, actually through what used to be the Netherlands Architecture Institute, we got commissioned to actually do a bit of research and to make a film. And so we got really excited, and in many ways for us this set the tone for how we would think about the office going forward. My partner is Turkish, and so the film was dealing with, just before the protests that happened in Istanbul roughly 4 years ago, we made the film. And so we made a documentary film where we were talking about how the cities in Turkey were being remade with a very strong hand from the government, and maybe some of the citizens were not so happy about it, but it was being used as a tool to develop the country. But we did it just before the protests, which was key, because of course we could get the citizens talking about what they didn't like and what they were critical of, but we were also able to get the voices of the urban planners, the architects, and the politicians who were about it, and they were very honest and open with us about the reality of what they were doing. So then we kind of started to produce the film, and then the film actually came out just after the protests happened, so it became a very nice document to explain. To be honest, I don't think it really helped Turkish people understand what happened. They were pretty aware. But for a lot of outsiders, it was a nice sort of piece to explain why there was such a frustration with how the urban planning was happening in their government. And then that led to a series of research projects and an exhibition that we did later as well, and led to kind of, like I said, our way of thinking about how we wanted to practice and what sort of values we had within our office. And then that translated back to the Netherlands. We were still living there at that time. It was an amazing time to be in Rotterdam or in the Netherlands around 2008 and 2009. I moved to the Netherlands from the United States because I loved that there was a big support from the government for the arts and these sort of things. So I found it really profound the way their government worked, and I was a big fan. But then after the crisis, there was a massive shift in terms of how funding happened in their country. And the Netherlands is still a wonderful place, and there's still lots of money to do things compared to other countries. But you could see a fundamental shift happened within the country about this idea of value and how they should spend money. And it was pretty shocking to see a country really shift itself very quickly because of a financial crisis. So based partially on that, because Rotterdam used to have a lot of lectures on architecture and urbanism because there were many institutes in Rotterdam. But after the crisis, many of those institutes disappeared. A lot of them lost their funding for public programs. So me and some friends, this wasn't just me, but we got together and decided to have a series of events where we would host architecture conversations. And we really did it in the back of a bar. And so we realized that people come through Rotterdam all the time. We could start to frame the public debate, or try to frame the public debate, about how cities are made. And also important for us, like I alluded to before, was it not just to be artists and architects, but to have a broader understanding, to visit some of the people producing food in the city and understand how they value the city and how these things work. This was something we wanted to talk about a lot. This is Christian of Zeus on his bridge that they're a bit famous for. Again, in Rotterdam, like a lot of young offices, you start with installation projects. We were invited to join as part of the Rotterdam Biennale to do an installation in public space. But we actually thought the area they were doing the installations, it was more interesting what was going on inside of the buildings and how that neighborhood was shifting. So we wanted to take this industrial building, which you see here, and you can kind of see our little installation here, and actually use it as a way to draw people into the building and host things. The area has a history of relating to fabrics, which is generally somewhat disappearing in Rotterdam, but a history of, let's say, fashion. And we wanted to use this fabric as a way to invite people into the building, to use the fabric to kind of change the space. And we even played around with the fabric because we're architects, we're interested in structure. We wanted to make the fabric structural. This is us hanging it upside down. We use the same thing, starch that you use to make your collar solid. We used it to make these archways. So these are self-supported pieces of fabric with arch, tall enough for me to walk through. So we wanted to play with this. So this, for us, still relates to urbanism, how art can kind of come inside the building and reframe a notion of history and of space. But maybe more importantly for us, we didn't want the installation to be just about us and our office. We used the installation to host some of our friends, to be honest, and some of the people in the area who were starting to do fashion in a more contemporary way. So actually this somewhat industrial area actually had a lot of people doing fashion in it, and we wanted to host them in our space to showcase what they were doing and to educate people coming through the area about what was going on. And you can see here in this photo this idea that the series of fashion designers started to add up, to be honest, in a very messy way in this space, so you could start to see a series of things that added up over a few weeks. Following that, we were invited to Bulgaria to be a part of their architecture festival, One Architecture Week. That was 2 years ago. And like any architecture festival similar to this, people stand on stage and give lectures. So we certainly did that, but we were interested in pursuing something a bit more, similar to how this festival is looking for something more. You know, we had exhibitions, we had small talks, we had installations in public space, but we wanted to get back to how the Maritsa River, as it goes through Plovdiv in Bulgaria, how it has a history that had been lost. Through the Soviet era, there'd been a lot of intrusions into the river to make sure it was safe. And these engineering solutions made it so people used the river a lot more. And the river had been kind of left for dead, let's say, and the city turned its back on the river. So we wanted to kind of remind the citizens that they have a history with the river and start to just do the first things to bring people back to the river. So we talked about a series of installations around the river, very simply just trying to activate these spaces that are now kind of dead in Plovdiv, which is a fairly quiet city, even though it's the second city of Bulgaria. Start doing a lot of programming in terms of having a stage made. We even had pop concerts, but also installations. This is by a Polish architect, to kind of give this sense of fun and engagement back to the waterfront. Not just a place to look out over, but that you can really engage with. And also not just to be about architecture and these big ideas, just to be very simple, just to get people out there maybe using the area to grow some plants and vegetables. We didn't need to talk only about art in a very high level. We could just talk in a very common way to common people about the value of public space and the value of making. This is Clemens, who's also been here at the CANactions Festival in the past. But working with some of the citizens and some of the children to play with, this was an abandoned gas station. How to work with what this is a Canadian artist, how to use light and shadow to create something a bit spectacular within the public space and what is an abandoned building. And then trying to leave some traces to remind people of maybe to engage with the river, and some of them even a bit silly about how to think about the river and its value. And then another project which I'm doing ongoing, which is a project in Africa, is a project in a slum in Nairobi, which is an informal settlement. It's a place for the poorest people of Nairobi, live in this particular community called Dandora. And the local community had started before we showed up. Let's be clear about that. They had taken it upon themselves to set up an idea of how they could improve their own public space. So they actually did it in a very scaling sort of way. They improved one courtyard, and then by the time we showed up, they had improved a couple more. And they had this system of suggesting, which is where we stepped in and kind of helped them, a system of scaling up this notion of public space improvement. So they started with what is one really small courtyard here, and then we helped them develop a strategy of how they could expand that to other courtyards, to other neighborhoods, to larger public spaces, to streets, and to some really large industrial spaces to create jobs. And this was an important goal for us. In a community like this, it's not just about creating quality public space. That's kind of not good enough when 40% of the people are unemployed and don't have much hope, especially for children. So yes, we worked on the public space, but the trick was, which came from the community organization, and we helped them with this, but came from them, was the idea of the key thing is always generating jobs. It's not just about making nice architecture or public space. How can we give them jobs? So how can we use the money that normally would go to contractors to give people things to do, whether it's security or installation or things like this? And we start to see the results now coming through. Obviously, engaging the young people in the neighborhood is key. And then one small story. If anyone's interested in donating money on Kickstarter, we do have a Kickstarter campaign for a campaign we're doing now, which takes it to the next level. We're proposing to take the plastics from the dump that's next to the site to make the bricks that pave the streets, with the idea that some of the colorful attitude that they have in Nairobi, in Dandora, in Kenya, that this sort of color that can come through in plastic could literally pave their streets. But that's another story. But now I want to talk about connections for a little bit and relate to it, because yeah, I'm the guy on the left with the huge head. But those of you who were here 4 years ago, that's Teemu. I believe he's Finnish, but I can't remember. I actually saw him just 4 days ago in Guangzhou, in China. For a lot of us that have been involved in this festival, this has really been a series of connections for us and has been really important and significant. So it was pretty funny for me to see Teemu, to bring my students, along with, that's Tyne on the right, who teaches in Bangkok. So he brought his students from Bangkok, I brought mine from Shenzhen, and he had his in Guangzhou. And through connections, we had a conversation in Southeast Asia about urbanism and architecture. But then I'll go back a bit to the next step I want to talk about a bit in terms of connections, and still is a bit of a bitter story, if I'm honest, is the second time I was here was because we were in a competition, which we lost. It was for the Edge, as it was called then. And we lost that competition, which we were very proud of it. I still think we had the better idea. But we lost it to the Colombians, Taller 301. And that's Julian. That's me and him talking just 2 days ago. Because the irony was, after we lost to them, that myself and Julian and Pablo developed a relationship. And we started to build that up over the years. And so first we did a competition for urbanism in Bogota. In Medellin, but in Colombia, where they're from. We had some ideas there. Then later we did actually a mosque competition in Kosovo, which recently we were approached to maybe build this in Turkey, which we're excited about that possibility. Then we started to get more into public space projects, and then we invited a friend of mine, Peter Veenstra, who's never spoke at Connections, but would be a lovely speaker. And we started doing public space projects. And what became interesting about that is they first got to meet the mayor of Bogota, actually because they invited him to come here to Kyiv to talk about the competition they won here. And then later it came around. Now, myself, Julian, and Pablo, and Peter, we work with the mayor of Bogota, because he's the mayor again, on a series of public space projects. So actually through connections, we met each other. It gave them an excuse to meet the very powerful mayor of Bogota, and has led to some of the projects that we do now. Because now, a big project we're working on is for what used to be and still is a water reservoir on the other side of Bogota. And actually, as you can see in this diagram, this water reservoir, when completed, will be the biggest public park in Bogota. And so it's a lovely park. It's already a beautiful site, to be honest. And Bogota, like many places in the world, does not have much money. So when we talk about a massive park project, we can't design it like they might be able to in Switzerland or the Netherlands. We have to be a bit creative. But it was kind of an infrastructural reality, this park. It was a reservoir. So there's all these relics. So we made the design about actually reinterpreting some of the pieces. Can we use the dams as slides? Can we use some of the channels for skate parks? Can we use some dams also for amphitheaters? It became about how we reuse and reinterpret what's there. Again, it's not about trying to convince the client to spend more money, but how to spend the money more wisely became the task for us. And even thinking about how a water kind of recycling system could become a public space. And even how we, although the mayor doesn't seem to be convinced of this idea, but we're really trying to convince him that the electrical wires can really become these beautiful kind of art pieces that almost look a bit referencing maybe the Native American history in their country. But I think the mayor won't go for that one. And we have more parks coming along the way. But for us, it all started, actually, that sort of matchmaking started here in Kyiv at Connections. Okay, for the last part of my lecture, and I'm reasonably on time, I'll talk about, now I'm still listed, and I saw on the map there I'm still listed as being in the Netherlands. I don't live in the Netherlands, and I'm not Dutch, but I do look the part. I now live in Hong Kong and in Shenzhen. Shenzhen is right next to Hong Kong. Shenzhen is in China. Hong Kong is not in China, if you ask Hong Kong people their opinion. But I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing in terms of education. I talk a bit about China, but it's more about the role of education. And I want to relate this more in the long run, have a conversation with what's going on here with the school they've started, the CANactions School of Urban Studies. But for us, it's interesting to be teaching about architecture and urbanism in Southeast Asia, because yeah, as you can see in the circle, more people live in that circle than outside of it. And Hong Kong is basically at the center of that circle. And everyone likes to talk about China as this crazy story, doing amazing things. But actually, if you take Japan, Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and a few others, and you take the moment they made massive economic reforms, and you put it on a chart, like you can see here, their form of economic development in terms of GDP is actually the same arch. So China is being much hyped as this kind of crazy sort of reality. In many ways, we argue this is just a new way of building economies and cities that's emerged in Southeast Asia. And now they're exporting it to the world. I don't know if the Chinese have showed up and started to try and build infrastructure in Ukraine, but if they haven't, they'll be here soon. They're everywhere. So they're much like the country where I'm from, the United States, where we exported our kind of ideology, our way of thinking to the world. China is now doing that. This is why it's interesting for us to be there and be a part of the education system there. So what can you learn? This is the city of Shenzhen. You can see on the right what it was 35 years ago and what it is now, from basically 200,000 people to 20 million in 35 years. And part of the Pearl River Delta, so Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Guangzhou you may have heard of. If you like to gamble, you might have heard of Macau. This collection of cities that's roughly 50 million people. But here's where it gets interesting, I think, related to those of us who like to design cities. You maybe can't read this perfectly, but what this is saying is for every architect, how many citizens there are. In Italy, Italians never like this chart, for every one person, there's about 400 regular people. In China, for every one architect, there's 40,000 people. Now, you could say that's a perverse way of doing architecture. You can say that Italy is crazy because they have too many architects. But for us, for what it points out is they're doing architecture in a different way than what we think of it in Europe or in the West. There's a different way of practicing. And for us, this relates to this big economic boom in East Asia. And then you think about what you can learn from this as architects. What can we learn from the city? The normal way of learning that I was taught as an architect or urban planner is you look at the city and you learn from it. One example is this very famous book, at least in the United States, Learning from Las Vegas. And they really looked at this notion of signage and tried to derive a new way of thinking about the city, but they were looking at the city still visually as objects, still trying to think of the city in that way. And you could do a similar thing in China where we're working. This is a urban village which contains, this is looking up, and that's 8 stories tall. These spaces are all about 2 meters across. You could derive something from those spaces in terms of how they feel. Oh, that's way too blurry. But we're interested in thinking about how we can learn from the city in a very different way. If you don't know about Shenzhen, that's fine, very understandable. But if you're into cheap electronics or cheap phones, or anything that's cheap and plastic and electronic, Shenzhen is the center of the world right now. And it's heavily criticized for being a place of copying and things like that. But the more you start to research it, the more you get interested in, there's a way of working there about design that's fundamentally different than the way we assume in the West. In Shenzhen, they make, quote, copy phones, but now they copy from each other. The standard way of producing a design in a Western, whether it's Apple, is you make one really perfect phone and you sell 1 billion. In Shenzhen, it's much more of it's about 100 companies, whether it's phones or tables or anything. It's about 100 companies usually kind of competing and collaborating at the same time. It's a different way of thinking about design. They behave very differently. And we at our school are actually inspired by that idea, how you can be more collaborative, how you can be more quick reacting and less based on long-term urban planning, and how you can take quick reactions, test things. If it doesn't work, you start over. How can we apply that to the city? So for us, getting now to education, this is where we again get to values, is how do we take these years of practicing and start to apply them to how we talk to these young, mostly Asian students of ours. This notion of relearning. Many people ask how I ended up in China, which is an extremely good question, and I still wonder. But we were invited to curate the educational platform for a Biennale. And we wrote a little bit of a manifesto, which isn't that interesting. But what I think is interesting that we pointed out is that fundamentally not only are our cities changing, but the way we think about education is changing. Everyone is aware that education is changing. You can learn on YouTube, you can learn via workshops. Everything is much more acceptable. So both of these things are changing at the same time. So it's an interesting place to be talking about education and urbanism and architecture because they're both shifting fast. So we did this thing that we called the Aformal Academy. And then, this is a funny picture of my head in Asia the first time. And when we thought about it, because I did a workshop in Beijing 15 or 10 years ago. And what I liked about that was because the professor wasn't from China and some of the students were, the notion of hierarchy was destroyed. It was never assumed that the professor knew better than the student. A lot of the learning went from the student to the professor. A lot of it went from student to student. And that was really important when we thought about the notion of education, is to destroy the idea of the master. Of course, the professor has a role, but it should be much more conversational, much more flat. And then within the context of the Biennale, it's a big event. People come, it's kind of a party, these sort of things. But we wanted to get our students out of the Biennale site and out into this very strange city and seeing what's going on and really working in the city was a goal of ours. As well as, again, as a place like Shenzhen that produces amazing amounts of plastic and electronics, we wanted to start working with our students because there, like most places, a lot of architects really think architecture is done in AutoCAD and in Rhino and in 3D Max and is not enough about really making things with your hands in the community. And we thought this was a bit of an installation we did with some artists. Again, this is Clemens, again, another CANactions alumni. We wanted to start to question how people use space through these sort of built objects. And we wanted to, and I see it again here in the space here, a place for children. We wanted to start thinking of education not just something for 20-year-olds, but for young people as well as older individuals. And this started to affect our working space. So that brings me to the last part. I am the director of, some other people started it, but we've started an academy for urbanism called Future Plus. If you like the name, I did not pick it. This is a real picture in China. This is how they take their exam to get into university. So one great thing about being in education in general, I mentioned before, is lovely, but being involved in education in Asia is really fantastic because they take it extremely seriously, so seriously that they do art exams like this. But there's many talking about the problem with how education works there as well. And this didn't turn out, which is fine. But this is a standard layout of how classes are given that we all know that look like Excel spreadsheets. That education is delivered in a series of standardized, usually broken down by semester, hourly delivered, and professors need to stand in it at that time. This very standardized role of university education has its value, but as I was alluding to before, there's room for other ways. And so for us, fundamentally, I would also add, coming back to this notion of hierarchy, we're just looking to learn ourselves. This is key for us. And we see our role of the school as not competing with the university, not even trying to provide professional education. We want to be kind of somewhere in the middle. That moment when maybe you have had a good experience at school, maybe even a bit of working experience, and you still want to experiment a bit like you can in school, but you still want to be involved in real projects. And we always work in collaboration, but this connection to practice and to the many different people. So not just purely academic, not constrained by the realities of real work. So now I'll talk about a few projects we did and how they relate to our values. And allow the translator to catch up, who I'm sure is not enjoying my fast American English. So one goal of ours is to host and to share. So we do a series of events. We had an open art gallery where there's tons of schools that come to China and study it. We invited them through the University of Southern California to just have an exhibition, to show all of these collectively so we could all see what all these different schools are studying in China. We did an urban film festival. There's been a lot, as China's done these crazy things, there's been a lot of great documentary films, and we hosted a film festival to share these films with the public, not just for our students, but with the public. But also, we like film because it's a way for us to talk about cities where we can really relate to the general public much more easily. Wow, his head is really big. That's Joseph Grima, who's an Italian, well, kind of Italian, designer, curator type of guy. And we're working with him to look at this area called Wachanbei, which is most known in Shenzhen for the cheap electronics. That gets to our maybe core issue of urbanism, is that we're actually less interested in form and more interested in systems, whether it's money systems, political systems, cultural systems. We're interested in that. And Joseph, through his film, and let's be clear, he was leading the film, we were just helping him. This electronics market that they had there, he was interested in and how it's transforming the public space. But it actually the film became more about understanding the logistics, about how this electronics market is half a place where you can buy cheap electronics, half factory, and half a place that delivers all over the world, and distribution centers become key. So understanding how a lot of people talk about how modern retail is dying, but this is a very strange hybrid that tries to connect industry, retail, and shipping. Study on rural China, and I always think this is funny, the rural issue. I'm not sure about the discourse here in Ukraine, but every country likes to talk about the rural. In the United States, since we just elected Trump, they all blame it on the countryside. In Italy, they talk about how the countryside is empty. China is panicked, but not enough people are talking about this being a global issue. And in China, what we got interested in studying, because they have a very particular model, which is tough to see here, but their way of developing the countryside is this weird mix of funding from the government, funding from often wealthy people who've moved to the city who actually just want to give back. So the funding streams are very complex. So we wanted to understand how it's being funded. Take action. As a school, we certainly do research, we do drawings, we do things like this, but we try and be really involved in the city, not strictly observing the city. So one project we're doing, if you roughly translate Jingguang, it means Starlight Village. It's a fairly rural area with fairly low-tech farming, with some abandoned buildings. And so we've started to work with the community to kind of try and find a way that we can maybe use these historic buildings as a testing ground. They're mostly abandoned, and we can use them to insert a new program that isn't about a design sort of agenda. It's more about the idea that in China, like many places, if you want to make money, you have to move to the city. So even if you wanted to stay, there's no way to make money in the village. So can we find programs and jobs for these people if they wanted to stay in the community, that they could remain? And we'll start it in these 4 abandoned buildings. We'll start the initial program this summer in terms of actually intervening. And then we work with people. This is David Lee, L-I. He's a tech person in Shenzhen, I'll say simply. We start to engage with technology a lot more and its value in terms of making cities. And one thing we did was we worked with the British Council, who I believe I saw was a sponsor for this event as well. They've been good to us. Where we brought in some British designers to kind of think about how a chair is fundamentally made. And they treated this chair as a skeleton and then allowed the users to design the chair in a different way. So each sort of person in the workshop reinterpreted the skeleton in a different way. So rethinking the way how we as designers frame things and how it's shaped. And then maybe more importantly, we talked about how this could connect to a very specific village, how we could activate the value of an industrial village by bringing designers into it. So most cities are trying to get rid of industry. In Shenzhen, we're trying to keep it, and we're trying to keep it by giving value to it through the perception of design. Real projects I mentioned as well. I'll go through this a bit fast. We actually engage in waterfront projects where we work with some existing abandoned buildings and try and work on that. So our school actually takes on real commissions and does it with our students. And then engage to work with the community. Like anywhere, working with a community is tricky. In a place like China, because of, I'll politely say, the reality of their government, people have become very comfortable with not confronting the government in terms of plans. So if you want to ask people what they think, a lot of them are very used to being quiet. So we started to use the role of games as a way to engage young children, and if we engage the children, then we can get them to maybe engage their seniors in terms of discussing the type of future they would want. And we're not the most advanced in terms of tools, but we also try and use these emerging technologies that architecture and urbanism is not just about plans and sections or just about renderings or things like this, but how can we use these new technologies to understand the city, to relate the city to people and explain it in a different way. And in that, I mean, not a pitch for the school, but we run a school where I think similar to what CANactions is trying to do with their program here, we're trying to just engage the reality that cities are made and thought about differently by different people and trying to open it up to a bigger conversation and trying to better understand, have a very open attitude where we're learning from others as well as providing some form of learning. So we're all just trying to figure out where cities are going collectively. If any of you feel like going to school in China, let me know. We have an opening for full-time courses in the fall with a few fancy teachers from abroad. But that's Future Plus, and that's me, LCC. Thank you very much.